So you've heard from Isaac and Tapio a bit about climate sensitivity and why it's been hard in the past to sort of nail it down, and a bit more about clouds and what we might do in the future. In the spirit of how Rob thinks, I guess I want to step back a little bit and talk a little bit about how we're framing and asking the question, and to ask, are there maybe different ways, perhaps better ways, of just framing this conversation about climate sensitivity. So if we kind of zoom out a little bit, here's one way of schematic representation of the whole problem, right? So we release emissions in gigatons of carbon per year, and that's on the left. That changes atmospheric concentrations measured in ppmv. That then impacts the climate, usually measured in terms of surface temperature. And then, of course, that leads to a variety of impacts, which are well known and much discussed. And so what we've been talking about so far in this panel is the climate sensitivity. So this arrow, which turns a given change in concentration of atmospheric concentration of CO2 into a temperature change. So this is usually measured in degrees C over ppmv. So we've heard about cloud feedbacks, which are a major contributor, both in terms of magnitude and uncertainty. We've talked a little bit about possible nonlinearities. One thing we haven't discussed is that what you mean by climate sensitivity actually depends on the time scale of what you're talking about. And so for a given change in CO2 concentrations, the amount of warming that you get depends on how long you wait, and in particular, it depends on whether you wait for the deep ocean to equilibrate with this change in the heat balance of the Earth. And that can take hundreds of years, perhaps 1,000 years. And so this leads to a sort of proliferation of jargon under which we work. So you've probably heard of the transient climate response as well as the equilibrium climate sensitivity, but if you're not really working with these quantities, they may end up sort of comprising a little bit of a fog, in which you try to think about how your work relates to the physical climate system. Another drawback of the way that we usually think about climate sensitivity is that it ignores this other arrow, the carbon cycle, right? When we release emissions, it's not that it all goes into the atmosphere. There's not a straightforward one-to-one relationship, right? And as most of you know, only about, in the present day, only about half of what we emit stays in the atmosphere, right? And a quarter goes into the ocean, and a quarter goes into the land. And there's actually some uncertainty about how those sinks are going to evolve in the future, especially with the land. And there's also feedbacks, right? That as the land and ocean sinks become saturated with CO2, their ability to uptake carbon is going to evolve. And so what I want to point out is that, you know, something that's been developing in the climate science community over the last, I'd say, 10 to 15 years is another way of thinking about the problem, which is to draw this arrow directly from emissions to the climate response without breaking it up into separate carbon cycle and climate sensitivities. One phrase for this quantity is the carbon climate response. It's also sometimes known as the TCRE, which is an acronym so unwieldy that I won't burden you with it, but just in case you've heard it, it's the same thing as this, but this is a little bit more manageable. And it's interesting to think about the units, right? It's, so the carbon climate response is measured in degrees Celsius per gigatons of carbon, not per year, but just the cumulative emissions, right? And this turns out to be, so you know, Tapio showed a slide asking, you know, when are we going to get to a certain, well, you know, what's our carbon budget and how long do we have? And it turns out that this carbon climate response is sort of a key quantity in figuring out what the carbon budget is, and therefore it's got implications for the Paris Agreement and other policies. All right, so what's the deal with this carbon climate response? So there's a fairly well-known paper by Susan Solomon in 2009 in PNAS. This is sort of the main figure from that paper. So say you take some Earth system models. So these are models that model the ocean and atmosphere and the physical climate and also model the carbon cycle. And let's say you ramp up your emissions such that your concentrations grow by 2% per year. And you do this, and then you ramp up to a specified concentration, and then you turn everything off, all the emissions. Right? And so you have a few different scenarios here, which a few different target CO2 concentrations. You shut down all the power plants, you turn off all the cars, and then you just look and see how the system responds. And now the crucial thing here is that this is an experiment in which the CO2 concentrations are not fixed, which you let them evolve, and you let the ocean and land sinks do their thing. And so what happens is, of course, that the CO2 concentrations decline from the peak, because there's no human sources and the natural sinks are acting, right? At the same time, that the deep ocean is taking up, that the ocean sinks and land sinks are taking up this carbon, they're also taking up heat. And so here's a plot of the ocean heat content. It's actually measured in thermal expansion. That's sort of a roughly equivalent way to measure the heat uptake of the ocean. And you see that, this continues to grow over time as the deep ocean equilibrates with this warmer world. But the sort of fascinating and maybe surprising and maybe even somewhat miraculous thing is that these two effects have opposite signs, right? So the decline in CO2 concentrations means a decline in the CO2 greenhouse effect from the peak. But the uptake of heat by the deep ocean is going to end up warming the surface ocean and hence the surface temperature of the Earth. And it turns out that when you run these models and you sort of allow both these effects to happen, the temperature response is basically roughly constant, right? Kind of almost regardless, the constancy happens regardless of how you get to. Of course, the warming that you get is a function of the cumulative emissions. And so surprisingly, when you add the carbon cycle to this picture, you actually get, it actually, in a sense, makes things simpler in that the deep ocean takes up carbon and heat at the same time, and the effects of those are opposing, and the result is a constant temperature response. And so what this means is that this very simple question of what happens if I shut everything off today, what's the temperature response, has a simple answer, at least a first order. Seizing emissions today will fix surface temperatures at today's values for hundreds of years, for as long as it takes the deep ocean to equilibrate. And after that, at the end of this time, which might take several hundred years, 1,000 years, CO2 concentrations don't go down to zero, they go down to maybe about 20% of the current values, and then other chemical and geological processes kick in to eventually return you to equilibrium, but that takes tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years. So I think this is an important conclusion that I'm not sure that we all sort of have fixed in our minds, especially when we're thinking about other metrics of climate sensitivity for which this is not true. And you can, another interesting thing about this is that it's both good news and bad news, right? The good news is that future warming is not constrained by past emissions, right? If we're going to get warmer than we are today in 100 years, it's because we're going to have emitted more in the meantime. So in some sense, we're in control of our destiny. That's the good news. The bad news, and I think this was the point that they were driving, Solomon and co-authors were driving home in this PNAS paper, is that the flip side of that is this warming is essentially irreversible on these timescales, right? You're not going to go back to pre-industrial temperatures through any natural cycles. You'd have to do some kind of geoengineering or carbon dioxide removal to get that. Another point that's worth making is that even though the surface temperatures remain roughly constant, the thermal expansion of the ocean is not, right? So the deep ocean temperatures, the surface temperature is staying fixed, but the deep ocean temperature is continuing to rise. There's thermal expansion of the ocean associated with that, not even counting the melting land ice and other things. And so sea level will continue to rise. So that's sort of an interesting consequence of this. Temperatures are flat after you shut off everything, but sea level is not. All right, so then you want to know, well, what's the number, right? The CCR, this degrees of warming per gigatons of carbon. What do we know about it? What do the models tell us? So here's a recent paper. And so the approach here was to take a number of Earth system models and run them under a scenario where you increase emissions such that you get a 1% per year increase in your CO2 concentrations. So here you just have the time on the horizontal axis. And then I've got this CCR on the vertical axis. And what they did is just for each model, each time, they just took the global mean warming and divided by the cumulative emissions so far, right? And so if you take the multi-model mean, then you get this black line. And it's about 2 degrees Celsius per 1,000 gigatons of carbon. So there's your carbon budget right there. Right? If you want to stay under 2 degrees of warming, you've got about 1,000 gigatons that you can release. We've released about half of that already, right? And that's telling you what you have left. Now, importantly, of course, there's spread here, right? And the spread here is actually due not just to the climate sensitivity and the cloud feedbacks that Isaac and Tapio were talking about, but also to carbon cycle feedbacks. And the spread is comparable. It's not that, because by including the carbon cycle, we get less spread. I'm not trying to say that. But I guess the point I am trying to make is that by actually including more of the system, you get a sort of metric for thinking about climate change, a number that you can talk about, a framing of the problem that is, on the one hand, more comprehensive because you're accounting for the carbon cycle. These experiments that we tend to run in modeling centers where we quadruple CO2 in the atmosphere and hold that fixed, that's illuminating for us as climate modelers, but it's not how the Earth works, right? You can't tell the deep ocean to take up heat without taking up carbon. It's going to do both, right, in reality. So this metric is more faithful to that, and it turns out not to have a bunch of different timescales that are then confusing to parse, right? And so for me, this is something that, Rob charged us with a couple tasks, one of which was to talk about tails and risks, which I haven't done a very good job of in these few slides. But the other which was to represent climate science as an evolving field and talk about things that we've learned recently. And so for me, this is something significant that I think the community has learned. We're still working on it, and it's something that I hope the broader community, which is represented here, appreciates. So that's all I have.
Thanks. My suggestion is that we broaden the conversation right